Welcome to the February 12th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and I'm joined by my co-host, our producer, MC Breadner.
Everyone.
So today we're going to be talking about, and I have to tell you, I don't know about you, MC, but I'm so tired of talking about Donald Trump. But given the fact that he's literally promised to annex Canada and turn it into the 51st state, it's kind of hard not to. So, what we're going to talk about today is something that has happened in response to his threat, which is that he's going to put 25% tariffs on a lot. In fact, he did put 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel. The other ones have been given a reprieve for 30 days. So we'll see next month. And there was a 10% tariff on oil. And we've done a couple of shows now exploring that whole issue of heavy crude and how the system works and how tightly integrated it is. But here's the thing we haven't really talked about. And that is that as soon as the idea of Canadian oil and gas exports comes back on the table, immediately there's a chorus of folks who are demanding the construction of more pipelines.
Yeah.
And we know that the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline costs the federal government $34 billion to build. So these are not cheap. There's been cost inflation, and we think that there needs to be a different approach this time. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, are you hearing the same kind of shrill demands for pipeline construction, revive Northern Gateway to the west and Energy East to the east out to the eastern coast?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, having the same old debates we had 10 years ago and 15 years ago when these pipelines were being debated before. I mean, there isn't a lot of alternatives being discussed outside of pipelines. And I think that's kind of where I'm a little surprised that we know how politically difficult it is to build pipelines, costly. It takes years and years and years to recover any investment that's made. So to me, it's shocking that there isn't discussion of other options.
Well, there are two kinds of pro-pipeline advocates that grind my gears, to be honest. The first one is those who are just willing to roll over for Trump. And Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, is one of those. She's taken a lot of criticism for that, for not being part of the Team Canada approach that the rest of the country is taking. But I'm seeing her stance reflected in a lot of people. And in fact, remember last week we had Gil McGowan, president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, on. He was at Friday's economic summit in Toronto. It was called by the Prime Minister. And he recounted stories of standing in conversations where people just said, give Trump whatever he wants. Just give him a win. We have no leverage. We have no power here. We're at his mercy. Yeah. And that is absolutely not the case. So that's one type, the ones who want to just roll over, and the other ones, they're kind of nasty. And we have, we talk about the MAGA politics down in the U.S. that supports
Mhm.
Trump and how extreme they are. Well, we kind of have our own version of that here, and a lot of it is rooted in the oil and gas culture in Alberta. And they like to come on my threads, and they like to say, call me a communist. And I remember one guy came on, and he's a retired oil and gas executive, pipeline executive, and he said that the federal Liberal Party and Mark Carney. Now, Mark Carney is leading the polls to be the next Liberal leader in Canada, uh,
Mhm.
and that would make him the Prime Minister. And I mean, this guy is an economist. He is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. Then he went to be the governor of the Bank of England. And
Yep.
then he was with BlackRock. Was it Blackfield?
Yeah, BlackRock.
No, Brookfield. That's what it was. Brookfield
Oh,
Asset
that's good.
Management in the financial field. And this guy's a communist? I mean, come on. But this is the level of the discussion we're having, and it's these are not people without influence who hold these views, and they're utterly ridiculous. Anyway, I had a few things to say about this in a bit of an editorial, so we're gonna watch that now. I've been interviewing energy economist Kevin Birn for almost a decade. If he says Canada needs a more strategic approach to oil and gas development in light of Donald Trump's threat to Canada's sovereignty, then we should pay attention.
When you think about a producing region that is in the middle of and far from coasts and landlocked for most of its history, Canada probably needs to think strategically a little bit harder about the need to access international markets wholly within itself. But it really does come down to when Canada thinks about it, what's in its strategic interest and what can it control and what's important for its preserving the benefits of these resources for Canadians.
This is a unique moment in time when Canada can take a beat and think about a national energy strategy. And I don't mean a new version of Pierre Trudeau's 1980 National Energy Plan, which is much reviled in Western Canada. I mean it in the same way Byrne means it. How does Canada maximize its return on hydrocarbon resources during a period of intense change in the global energy system? And I would add, which new clean energy industries should Canada invest in so that we are well positioned for the electric future that is arriving more quickly than we imagined only a few years ago? The first thing we need to do is change the energy conversation. As predictable as geese flying south in a few months are the oil and gas shills demanding new pipelines. You see them on social media and in the news media exhorting Canada to revive the canceled Northern Gateway project to the West Coast and the Energy East project to the Eastern Coast. And they've even persuaded the premiers of BC and Quebec to muse publicly that these pipelines should be supported. You know who you don't see promoting these kinds of projects? The pipeline companies themselves. And that should tell us something. The world has changed a great deal during the last 5 years. We are living through an incredible technological revolution that is affecting all sectors of the economy. Clean energy, wind, solar, batteries, EVs, heat pumps, that's a subset of that revolution. It benefits from advances in other sectors like artificial intelligence, modern materials, chemistry, and so on. Energy is now a technology, not a commodity, and that changes everything. Canada needs a national strategy that incorporates 20th century energy, like oil and gas, with emerging 21st century energy technologies, renewables, advanced geothermal, perhaps advanced nuclear on the supply side, and the plethora of new technologies on the demand side, like EVs and heat pumps. How much industry to manufacture hydrocarbon and clean energy technologies can be built in Canada? How should we use that industry to build supply chains, build Canadian businesses, and support Canadian job creation? These are just a few of the questions we need to answer as part of a national strategy for a 21st century energy economy. But the very first thing we must do is stop listening to the energy incumbent proxies. Stop putting the cart before the horse. Plan first, then execute. To echo Byrne, what is our strategic interest in energy? If we can't answer that question, then it's way too early to be talking about building new pipelines. All right, I had a few things to say, and my general conclusion, I think, I agreed with Kevin Birn, the economist who you saw in that clip, and who said that Canada must have a better approach to a strategic interest. Why, if we're going to do pipelines, why are we doing pipelines? Does it meet our national goals? Does it even meet Alberta's goals? There's all kinds of things to be discussed. And one of the things that I never hear, and I'd be interested to know if you hear, is since 2020, we've been in a major acceleration of the energy transition at the global level. Nobody ever talks about it. We talk about
Hmm.
pipelines as if this was, the year 2000 or 1990 or something, and we don't acknowledge that the global energy system is being transformed in Chinatown. I don't know. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's like, again, like I said, it's just the same old thing over and over again, and we're not taking into account that there's new opportunities, there's new technology. This technology-led energy transition is happening around us, and we seem to not be paying attention.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so anyway, Kevin Birn had another. We're going to talk next about international markets for Canadian heavy crude because that's kind of his specialty. And he had some thoughts about how the international markets are going to, what's important, and his comments would be important context for a strategic discussion of where Canadian oil, what we should do going forward. So let's watch that clip.
It's not that the world is short on resource potential. It's what's the economics to get it to market and what are consumers willing to pay and what does that look like? Right now, we have a world where we do have a lot of abundance in oil and gas. Accessing it and getting it to the right places is the key challenge that drives price differentials right now around the world. And so that infrastructure, the ability to connect, is a major source of competitive advantage and disadvantages for people.
Okay, so now we've had Kevin Birn on a couple of times, and here's an oil and gas economist saying we need to take a strategic approach to this. So let's get the PowerPoint up. We've got some slides that we want to go over, and one or two of these you've seen before if you've watched previous shows, but I think it's important for everybody. We kind of need to set the stage for the conversation. Okay. Now, what you see in this slide is crude oil exports by type and province. So when we talk about oil exports, really we're talking about Alberta. I mean, you look at that, this is 2024 data, exports, but production data is closer to 4 million barrels a day. That makes Alberta a major producer. It's more than Iran and Iraq. Alberta's the eighth largest, all by itself, the eighth largest oil producer in the world. I mean, this is important. But the light blue is light sweet crude, and the dark blue is the ultra heavy sour crude that comes out of the oil sands. It's bitumen, and it gets diluted. It gets upgraded into synthetic crude at a couple of upgraders in Alberta, or it gets shipped out as raw bitumen, about 2 million barrels a day of that, diluted with light hydrocarbons. And so this is basically the structure of our exports, and all of our exports at this time, almost all anyway, go to the United States. So we can get the next slide up, please. Okay, so when we're discussing, this is a really important point when we're discussing whether or not there are international markets for Alberta ultra heavy sour crude. And this comes from a report that Kevin Birn and his team wrote in 2018. You'll see it down in the right-hand side, IHS Market. And I asked Kevin this question, here we are 7 or 8 years later. Has any of this changed? He said, well, it's changed a little bit, but not that much. And so what this shows is that out of the various crudes that are refined around the world, 10 million barrels a day out of 103 million barrels a day is the heavy sour. And so that's the entire sum total. And what that means is that a refinery that runs light sour, light sweet, or medium sour is not necessarily kitted out to run heavy sour. And that limits the number of refineries in the world. And I have a slide that shows all of the refineries down in the U.S., but that doesn't mean much to this conversation, so we'll leave that for another day. But anyway, the point here is that there is the market for the product that Alberta produces is about 1/10 of the global market. So when we say oil, we need to understand that mostly what we're talking about, 80 to 90% of Canadian crude, is going to be bitumen, the ultra heavy sour crude. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is really interesting because essentially this is where all of the refining process is located. Now, you'll see there it's just under 10 million barrels a day. And Kevin thinks that now we're probably up to about 10 and a half million barrels a day of refining capacity because China has built some really big refineries that can switch between fuels and petrochemicals. And some of those will use heavy crude. So, and this is an important point is, he stresses that this is not all locked in stone. Some refineries will change the slate of crude that they use. Some will blend an ultra heavy, like a heavy crude, with a lighter crude. Because that is, the prices are better and it's better suited to the product that they want to produce, which, could be aviation fuel, diesel, bunker C, on and on. There's a number of things that refineries produce. So talking to Kevin, once you get into the details, one of the things is that there's a lot of shifting. It's not all written in stone and not all inflexible, but that for the most part, this is what you see. So in the U.S. Gulf Coast alone, which is Texas, Louisiana, 29% of all of the capacity for refining Alberta crude is there. Then there's another 25% in the rest of North America, and we'll see a distribution of a better distribution of that in the next slide. Then you've got Asia at 23%, and a lot of that will be China, India, and Southeast Asia. I think are now about 1.8 million barrels a day. And then you see Europe at 7%, the Middle East at 7%, Latin America at 8%, because Latin America actually produces a lot of the the heavy crude in Brazil, places like Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, and of course, Mexico. So the question then becomes, and the reason why I wanted to show this is if you're already 55% of the market is in North America, and you're already doing, 3.2, 3.3%, sorry, 3.2 or 3.3 million barrels a day, and you've got about 65% of that market already, and you're going to be increasing the output from the oil sands another 600,000 barrels a day by the end of the year, then should you go for more, try to push some of your competitors out of the American market? What role might Trump's tariffs, or maybe he doesn't put tariffs on, maybe he takes tariffs off. Very unpredictable. But this is, if you're not going to do that and you want to go, say, to Asia, well, that's great. Now we've got Trans Mountain expansion, and about 55, 60% of the oil that's been shipped through Trans Mountain expansion, loaded on a ship, and then exported, has gone to Asia, and the rest of it would go down to the west coast to California. Is there more room in Asia? We don't know. We know that some
Yeah.
petrochemical manufacturing is going to grow significantly between now and 2050 because of the sort of middle class economies that are going to want more stuff. They want to live like we do. I'm looking around my office, and I've got a TV where there's a lot of plastic, and my monitor. I mean, everything that is in my office has got some plastic attached to it in one way
Hmm.
or another, and that comes from petrochemicals. So the argument is that there will be a lot more demand that comes from the petrochemical sector. Will it be heavy crude though? I mean, it could be
Right.
another type of crude. It could be natural gas liquids. It could be, we don't know that. Or do we know that and it hasn't entered into the conversation yet? But if Kevin is right and Canada needs to be more strategic, it seems to me that we should be asking these questions.
Hmm.
Where are the market? And here's another thing that Kevin said. Now, in my interview with him, I've got a number of clips that we'll be using over the next few days. He said, Canada has now got a reputation for not being able to build infrastructure like pipelines. He said is very likely that whether we build one or two or no, assuming we build any, but if it will require public money.
Yeah.
And we know already that, the federal government had to jump in and buy Trans Mountain expansion and own that because the Kinder Morgan, the American company, was just going to abandon it and it wouldn't have gotten built. And it costs $34 billion. And we haven't got a buyer for that yet. So how many more billions of dollars will the Canadian taxpayer be expected to put into another pipeline or two and maybe, other infrastructure that's related to it? How many? And here's another issue that if you're being strategic, you should think about. What is the liability management regime for all of these assets that
Yeah.
we're going to build? Because we look at Alberta and we know there is a classic example of a liability management system gone awry. And now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is Alberta decided, 100 years ago, that it was going to not take security for reclamation at the beginning of a well's life. So
Hmm.
there are some places in North America, a few, that require a bond. And it's not a very good system, but at least the intent was there. And so the intent is that there'll be a pot of money available when that well stops producing and needs to be reclaimed. Alberta didn't do that. Alberta said, no, no, we're going to assume that at the end of that well's life, there will be a viable oil company that will own it and they will pay out of their revenue to do well.
They'll volunteer to clean it up.
Well, they'll do no. The law says they have to, and there's lots of
Oh,
loopholes, but nevertheless, legally they are bound to reclaim those sites. The problem is what they do is, the big companies have done this for decades and decades. They bundle a bunch of assets like wells and gas processing plants and whatever it is. They bundle it together and they sell it off to a junior company that's poorly financed and 2, 3, 4 years down the road, that company goes bankrupt.
mm,
So
yeah.
the big company, got rid of depleted assets that really had no value, and most importantly had environmental liabilities attached to them, and fobbed it
Yeah.
off on a little company that it probably knew was going to go belly up. And now,
Hmm.
Alberta's got 75 or 80,000 suspended wells, or sorry, inactive wells is the category name, that are just sitting there. And they're really, in my opinion, kind of orphan wells. Uh,
Right.
they've probably got an owner on the lease. So if Alberta has mismanaged its liability management of its oil and gas assets so poorly that one study from the Alberta Energy Regulator estimated those liabilities at unfunded liabilities at $260 billion. What then should Canada require from pipeline companies? If they're gonna participate in the building of, Northern Gateway or Energy East or whatever it might be, then how is the taxpayer going to be protected from not losing that investment and then not being on the hook to clean up the mess if it becomes a stranded asset? I mean, you're a taxpayer. Wouldn't
Yeah.
that annoy you a little bit to know that the government was being kind of cavalier with your tax dollars?
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, it's a real problem in Alberta, and so this is one of the strategic issues that needs to be discussed. Uh, Kevin says Canada needs to do a better job of being strategic, and this is one of the things that comes under that context of being strategic. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and we've used this slide in other shows. But this is data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. This is like the official data from the U.S. And it shows that in the Midwest, about 2.5 million barrels a day. I think I said 2.8 at one time because I was looking at a different graph, but around 2.5 million barrels a day. And it all comes from Canada. And then you've got the Rocky Mountain, which is, 300, 400,000 barrels a day, all from Canada. The U.S. Gulf Coast is much smaller. Now, Kevin, you probably saw, or you will see shortly, we have Kevin's graph, which is very different because for in his graph, the U.S. Gulf Coast is the biggest by far refiner of heavy sour crude, and the Midwest is much smaller. And he explains that by saying that a lot of this oil enters into the Midwest where it's counted, but then gets transshipped down to the Gulf Coast. So the actual numbers that get processed, that get refined, are smaller, lower in the Midwest, much higher in the U.S. Gulf Coast. So now
Right.
let's have a look at okay. So this is a distribution by those groups that we just saw: the East Coast, the Midwest, the U.S. Gulf Coast, the Rockies, and the West Coast. And you can see it's the U.S. Gulf Coast has a much bigger, it's almost 3 million barrels a day. And the Midwest is much smaller, down at 1.1, 1.2. Now, because of Kevin's estimation of transshipment, this may not be accurate. It may be somewhere in between what the EIA and S&P Global think. My point here is that there is about 2 million barrels a day of production that is supplied by other suppliers. And those suppliers include Mexico. It's about 600,000 barrels a day of what's called Mexican Maya, which is a heavy crude. And then there's Venezuela, which has had all sorts of problem. Its production has been declining for many years, I think since about 2016 at least. And then there's Colombia, Brazil, where you have lived, produces some heavy crude. So the question is, when we're looking at this strategically, we looked at it from the international point of view. Which of those markets do we think that there's demand for? Who can we talk to some experts and so that they can give us their expert opinion on where Canada might be able to pick up market share in those markets. So we need that kind of data so that we can start to have a strategy here. And then the question becomes, what about the US? Is there more room for Canada in the US? So Mexico has been talking for a while now about taking Maya and refining it domestically instead of sending it to the US. That might open up 600,000 barrels a day of market that Canadian
Hmm.
supply. Um, who knows what's going to happen in Venezuela? That's a very, they've had political turmoil, and
Yeah.
so that's been so. Do we? And there's also a fair amount of pipeline space that can be optimized, about 650,000 barrels a day of extra space, extra shipping capacity in the existing system. So if you're looking at it, instead of building a 35, 40 a billion dollar pipeline to the West Coast or out to the East Coast, maybe if what you did, you just said, you know what, we're just going to use what we have and we'll send it down to the Gulf Coast, or we'll send more of it to the Midwest. That's part of a strategic consideration,
Hmm.
and it deserves to be put into the conversation. We don't have, maybe we'll get out of the PowerPoint now, because the last thing I want to talk about is non-combustion uses for bitumen. And we had a little story. I have a little anecdote I want to share with you. So in September of 2023, I was in Calgary covering the World Petroleum Congress, and I was wandering around looking for stories, and I came across a technical presentation. So this is, it's basically you've got scientists or oil and gas people who are giving presentations on some technical topic. This one was all about materials, advanced materials from oil. And the moderator was Dr. Ibrahim Abba, and
Hmm.
he's a VP of technology for Saudi Aramco, so the big, huge Saudi company. Then there were three scientists on the stage, and one of them was from China, and another one was a manager that worked under Dr. Abba, and then the third one was from Alberta, Dr. Paulo Baumann. And I've interviewed Paulo for years. I probably started back in 2017, 2018.
Hmm.
And he works for Alberta Innovates. And Alberta Innovates is one of the leading researchers in the world finding ways to turn bitumen into what's called carbon fiber precursor. So what you do, you make the precursor, then the uh, the carbon fiber manufacturing company, and I spoke to Zoltech down in Missouri about this, interviewed them, and Alex Walk was the VP I talked to, and so their company would build a manufacturing facility in Alberta to make carbon fiber, and they would take this carbon fiber precursor, that's their feedstock, and then out of that they would make carbon fiber and sell it all over the world. And he said you always put the manufacturing plant as close to the source of precursor as you can. So this isn't going to, this is not a case where you ship precursor off to Ontario and Ontario gets all the benefits. This is
Right.
an opportunity for Alberta. You could build a domestic market, and they think that this carbon fiber is going to be 50% of the current cost of carbon fiber. This is why you don't see carbon fiber in automobiles. It's too
Right.
expensive.
Too expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you cut the price in half and then you lightweight these EVs, which are heavy because of the batteries, bingo, big demand. So they think
Hmm.
that there's going to be a very big opportunity here, and they think that they will have the commercial process in place in 2026, maybe 2020 later this year, but for sure by 2026. They're in the last stage of a grand challenge. That's one opportunity. So Alberta Innovates put out a white paper in 2023, and it said if you get $50 for a barrel of bitumen, if you turn that instead into carbon fiber, that same barrel nets you $217 of value. And if you turn it into asphalt binder, which you need to make roads, it's
Hmm.
$100. And if you turn it
Wow.
into activated carbon, which can be used in, products like that go into batteries, and it'd be
Yeah.
$120. So when we're looking at, if you're looking at this strategically, you say, well, why are we leaving all this money on the table? We're shipping off raw bitumen down to the Americans where they make money off it because they're selling their light sweet crude in Europe for, you know, 75, 80, 90 $90 a barrel. Um, why would we do that? That's crazy. Maybe we should now think of it strategically and say, you know what, given that there's an energy transition coming and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the future of oil, maybe we should start building an industry in Alberta that 10 years from now could be a domestic market for a lot of that bitumen. And
Yeah.
so instead of shipping it off to be burned, combusted in a combustion engine in a car, we'll have a non-combustion use for that material. And this has been going on for a long time, and there's interest, and the oil sands companies have got investments in this
Hmm.
research, and they've supported it and all of that. But it's the urgency. It's the urgent. There's really no urgency. And at that World Petroleum Congress, uh, I went to Premier Danielle Smith's press conference, and I asked the question about, is there a plan B? Have you got, what happens if
Yeah.
things don't work out the way you think they're going? And she made a very offhand comment. She went, well, I mean, if there's the demand for our oil goes down, we'll make stuff with it. That's the extent of the strategic approach from the Alberta government. Ah, yeah,
Yeah.
don't worry about it. We'll do something else with it.
We'll figure that out later.
Yeah, I mean, these things take, you look at what the Chinese did with the automotive industry. It took them a
Hmm.
good 15, 20 years to
Yeah.
really ramp up and get to the point now where they have a competitive industry. And so you don't build these things overnight. You've got to do it now, looking ahead to 2035, to
Yeah.
2040. That's strategy. That's a strategic approach, what Kevin Birn was talking about. And it all should be on the table in discussions amongst the provinces, the players, the industry, labor, the government, the policymakers. We should be working on this strategy now so that we have some direction. Because otherwise, you know what happens? Here's how it works. You know, the the pipeline companies. Oh, by the way, there are no pipeline companies promoting pipeline projects at the moment. It's only the what I call the shills, as I said in the editorial.
Yeah.
But so the producers will say, okay, we think that between now and 2030, we're going to produce another 600,000 barrels a day. And then the pipeline company says, well, I think that there's enough market here, there's enough demand that we could fill up a pipeline. And so we'll build a pipeline to the West Coast or, wherever. And then so they put an application and the Canadian Energy Regulator reviews it, and there's a big long approval process and so on and so forth. But it's really just the companies responding to market demand. There's, the people who actually own the resource, which is the people of Alberta, and to some extent the people of Saskatchewan. Nobody's there representing their interests.
Yeah,
Nobody's
exactly.
representing nobody's representing the people of Canada and saying, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe there's a more strategic role. Maybe we want to talk about the energy transition, and how that might threaten the integrity of these assets and the long-term viability of them, and who's going to pay to clean them up, all of that kind of stuff. So the wrong players are at the table. In my opinion, you know, this might be the way we've done it for, I don't know, 75, 80 years. When did we start building pipelines across provincial and international borders? A long time ago. And maybe
Yeah.
that's the way we've always done it. But when things start to change in the energy system in which we operate, when there's a new reality emerging because we're switching from commodities like oil and gas over to technologies like wind and solar and advanced geothermal and on, we ought to be a little more, we ought to say, we did it this way, but that's not good enough now. Now we need to do it a different way. And we're not saying that at all. I have not seen one person, not anybody, come out and say that we need to take a different approach to think about how we use these resources for the betterment of all Canadians and including Albertans. And that's
Yeah.
what we're advocating for. That's what Energy Media is advocating
Absolutely.
for. Yes, is a planning process so that we're doing exactly what Kevin Birn suggested, which is being more strategic with the resource to get more benefit out of it. So thank you very much. You've been very patient, MC, while I rambled on here about the slides, and thank you very much. Any thoughts now, as a taxpayer, as a Canadian,
Hmm.
if you heard the argument that I just laid out, what would you think?
I would be hoping that we had some leaders listening to you. Um, and I'd also be hoping that we'd be looking at alternatives, to be honest. Like we have to start doing things differently. It's we're in a different time now. It's not we're not in 1990s anymore. And we need to respond differently.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I gave you a leading question. I had a pretty good idea what you would answer. But nevertheless, I mean, it really is true that in
Yeah.
Canada, and I'll say this, I've said it many times before on our podcast and on the show, and I'll keep saying it. When I talk to experts in the US, Europe, and China and other parts of Asia, they are engaged in the energy transition. They're
Yeah.
engaged in this idea of we're transitioning away from our old
Yeah.
hydrocarbon, fossil fuel based, and we don't talk about that in Canada. All we talk when we bring it up, we bring it up in the context of the worst or the best possible case for an oil company, which is OPEC's narrative about how oil is going to go from 103 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels a day in 2050. That's it.
Yeah.
And you can't build better policy. You can't do things more strategically if you're having entirely the wrong conversation about the resource in question or about the energy
You're
system.
ignoring an entire portion of what we could be talking about.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up today. We'll be back tomorrow. So, MC, thank you very much.
Yeah. See you later, everyone.